I think I'm just going to pick up this mic here, and I can speak loudly enough so that everyone who's still eating can still hear me. As she said, I am Avantha Arachchi. I am the COO of A-Frame Brands, which is a portfolio of brands that are focused on underrepresented groups, places where 30 to 50% of the population have been left behind. And that portfolio also happens to be full of amazing celebrity founders like John Legend, who many of you heard from yesterday, but as well as Gabrielle Union and Dwayne Wade and Naomi Osaka. Now, that is normally how I introduce myself, because like many of you workaholics, work is the biggest through line to what my identity is. But there's a lot more that happens that exists and affects the way that I exist in this world that is tied to my identity. I am a transgender plus-size woman of color. By every definition of that, I am considered a minority. And in many lenses, they'd be right. I have spent most of my career in fashion and beauty, and it's been a really hard-fought battle. I think probably a hard-fought battle for many of you, too. Existing in rooms and spaces and times that oftentimes push you out, feel like doors are closing, and that you have to jump higher than anyone else to be able to get the same level of success. And I often talk about transitioning in business because it's a really rare glimpse into how bias actually exists, and in a very tangible way. Because transitioning doesn't happen in a snap. It happens in waves. And I transitioned while I was in business. I was consulting at the time. And so I had the opportunity to introduce myself differently from one week to another while I was working on projects, pitching similar projects to similar groups of people. But I would introduce myself as identifying as male to start, and then would eventually start identifying as female in those spaces. And experienced a really strange, baffling, stark difference in how I was treated between those. When I identified as male, it felt like all lights were green. I would be able to breeze through projects and have proposals approved without any kind of questions, because my authority in that space wasn't questioned. But when I identified as female, it was like all lights were red. I would have to pore over all of my presentations with folks and spend time and time again being able to explain things and explain every morsel of data that was questioned over and over until there was nothing left to question. It felt like I was climbing a mountain when other people got helicopters. And in that time, I lost a lot of accounts because other consultants were able to move faster and they were able to get their things approved faster. But I think that experience shaped everything who I am today and everything that we build today, because it gave me that really baffling, stark difference about how bias actually exists and how inequity actually exists in this world, and really wanting to commit to being able to change that, to be able to create a place where founders can be able to build things for underrepresented groups and products that are made for underrepresented groups. It also gave me this lens of what is real and what people are experiencing, and what is not real, what people think is real. Because, as I said, I'm a transgender plus-sized woman of color, and every single part of that is considered an underrepresented identity. And I think it's interesting to think about the idea of underrepresentation, because what underrepresentation actually is that the reality of the world doesn't align with what you see. And what you see and what exists in media, in products, isn't aligned with what the reality of things are. And that is the case across each of those different lenses. We could start with the first, that's maybe the most obvious, women. Women make up 50% of the US population, and yet have been left out of designing, building, and testing products across categories. One of my favorite examples is seatbelts. So many of you might not know that crash test dummies were built with male-identifying bodies. And so that has actually led to a huge increase in mortality rates for women. Women die more often in car accidents because cars aren't tested with female bodies. And although I think there's a lot of optimism there, because I think this is the first year that they now have female crash test dummies. So hopefully that'll continue, that'll make some changes there. My second favorite example is heart medications. Heart medications have only been tested on male bodies, which means that women are at risk of more side effects because it's easier to be able to create a smaller sample size of one individual type of person and get that approved by the FDA than it is to be able to think about the side effects for women. So women have been considered an afterthought across all of those aspects, in spite of being actually the majority in the US. One of the other probably salient examples is for people of color. Though a minority in the US, that is changing. So the census in 2015 showed that children under the age of 5, more than 50% of them had at least one parent of color. And that means would identify as a person of color themselves. That's around 9 years ago. And that means that children under the age of 14, more than 50% of them have at least one parent of color, which is Gen Alpha, which is who we continue to talk about in beauty as some of the most influential people about how you can be able and where you need to go to be able to get new consumers. And yet, all of the imagery that exists around Gen Alpha is starkly white. Why is the most diverse generation, when we represent them in beauty, not represented by the actuality of their data? Potentially less salient for this group, but I think it's generally very important to think about in representation, is body size. 68% of the US population wears above a size 14. 0.6% of designer clothes and 9% of general market are above a size 14. And actually most US retailers don't actually even have above a size 14. I can tell you that personally, as a size 16, that I don't really shop in store because most of the time I can't try on clothes. And then potentially most controversially, the queer communities have often been seen as minuscule and marginal. And that is what happens when you demonize groups like that. We see it with left-handedness over the past couple of centuries, that when it was demonized, many people didn't identify as left-handed. But when it wasn't, you started seeing this huge shift and huge growth in that area until it leveled out. So today, there are studies that show that 1 in 5 Americans identify as LGBT+. That is even a huge improvement on when I was growing up, it was 1 in 10. And I would always think about, okay, there are 10 people in this room, I'm the one, and it would feel a little bit isolating. But we've seen growth where it's 1 in 5 now. But the most incredible thing is that when you start looking at Gen Alpha and Gen Z, there are studies that show that it's 3 in 5. Which means that they're going to be the majority at some point. All of these elements are places where either today or in the future, these groups, these underrepresented groups, are actually now the majority or going to be the majority. And yet, we've never been considered the default. I've never been considered the default. When you close your eyes and think of a default beauty and fashion consumer, I don't think they look like me. When I close my eyes, I don't think it looks like me. And that's the nefarious thing about bias. It exists and it runs through everything that we do. In spite of that, I mean, the women, beauty and fashion has always began and ended with us. Women of color spend more on beauty and personal care than any other demographic. Plus-size consumer spending increased 10% higher every year over year for the past 10 years, in spite of supply issues and declines in straight sizing. Queer communities are power users of beauty, utilizing the tools at their hands in a way that is like art, and have also been central to trends around beauty as wellness and around non-traditional female and male beauty. And yet, we always see that these consumers that are on the edges of beauty and fashion are not considered, even though they are more discerning, they have deeper and stronger connections to those brands when they find them, and they end up becoming actually better consumers at the end of the day. This may be counterintuitive, because especially to cis straight white men that are in high rises that want to make decisions about society, but the data doesn't lie. Brands have an incredible opportunity to be able to thrive by focusing on diverse consumers. And the biggest way that I believe to be able to do that is to be able to have a diverse team yourself. And especially small brands, I know there are a lot of small brand founders here, you have an incredible opportunity to be able to use this as your superpower against those Goliaths. Because you have all of the tools to be able to do it better than those. It is going to enable you to be able to innovate and work faster than any other big company that's out there in this incredibly competitive space. And to do that, you need to change the way that you hire, change the way that you collaborate, and change the way that you interact. And small brands are better at doing all of those than a giant brand, because it's much easier to be able to steer a rowboat in a different direction than it is a giant ship. So with the first one, changing the way that you hire, it is so much easier for a small brand to be able to bring in diverse folks than a giant company. And that's because statistically, if the percentage of diverse folks in that company is small, it's incredibly hard to be able to make it go higher. But when you hire diversely early, it actually allows you to be able to compound that and continue to have a diverse team. To be able to change the way that you collaborate, you have to be able to make sure that once you bring those people to the table, they feel comfortable being able to be their best self and give all of the value of diversity that you wanted to be able to bring in. And to do that, you actually have to create a culture that is comfortable about conflict. Because when you bring diverse voices to the table, you are actually creating a culture of conflict, because those diverse perspectives have diverse perspectives, and they're going to disagree. But it has to have an underlying element of respect for each other, and respect for each other's expertise, and respect for each other's perspectives to allow you to be able to harness that conflict for good. And big companies are very bad at using conflict. They're very good at using politics to kind of push that conflict away, but very bad at being able to harness it for good. And last, changing the way that you interact. To be able to make sure that you can create a culture where all lights are green, or at least everyone has the same amount of green lights, you need to center vulnerability and center a conversation to know that the way that I exist in this world is different than the way that you exist in this world, which is different than the way that they exist in this world. And being able to talk about that, because it changes the way that we all are able to do work. And it's incredibly hard to create that level of vulnerability in a giant company. It's a lot easier when you're a team of 10 around the table. You can get into the deeper things. Whereas majority of the time I've experienced, when you're working at a giant company, that sort of vulnerability is often thought of as weakness, whereas it should really be your strength. At the end of the day, when you can use all of these different things to be able to get ahead, you will create products that are more resonant to a broader set of people and more innovative, because you've built a team that has never been built before, and that's how you create new things. You will create messaging and content that is more resonant and authentic to a broader set of all of these different communities that are the growing demographics in this country. And you will, at the end of the day, have higher stock prices and higher acquisition prices, because that is statistically what happens. When diverse founders exist and when diverse teams exist, they do better. So my last piece of advice for all of you, and that's a rare thing, because I think those of you who know me know that I just talk too much, and I give too much unsolicited advice. But my last piece of advice is really focusing on your people. Because people and culture drive everything else that you want to be able to do. And oftentimes, actually, small founders skimp on thinking about people, because there's so many other bright, shiny things to be able to do. And there's so many things that feel impactful and that are actually likely impactful, but the basis has to start with people. Because founders are not an island. You can't scale and grow and do all of the amazing things that you can do on your own. You need to be able to have people that you connect with, that you trust, that are bringing incredible ideas and ideas that are different than yours to the table to be able to help continue to grow. Now, I feel really blessed to be able to be talking in this type of room, because I think this is a very different room than I've ever gotten to speak to, because I think that the people here really value what exists in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that this type of conference, which is the first type of conference around this, is really noting a change that's happening in this world. And it's a change where I actually feel a lot more optimistic that the face of beauty will look a lot more like you, will look a lot more like me, and that just fills me with joy. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you and rant at you for today. I love talking to founders. I love helping people go to their next step. So if there's ever anything I can do, please let me know. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but if we do, I would love to do that. No time, I'm sorry. Come find me later. Thank you.
No, not yet. Next one. Thank you so much.